Hey guys, I have completely flipped the order of this video and I'm going to start with the customer reviews and you're about to see why. So my initial plan was to finish with a summary of the online reviews, tallying up the most common pros and cons, because I know my experience of Whoop might not be everyone else's. Initially, I was a little bit surprised to see that they only scored 2.6 out of 5 on Trustpilot, but as I worked my way through every single review since the Whoop 4.0 was released, I was then amazed that the score was as high as 2.6. So, what did the reviews actually say? Let's start with the positives. Customers mainly appreciated the data itself, the analytics, and the sleep tracking, followed by the fact that wearing a Whoop has had a positive impact on their health, with people taking action based on their scores. The negatives centered around connectivity. It seems that the Whoop has problems with many Android 13 phones, inaccurate data, in particular an inability to distinguish sleep from wake, and heart rate being unreliable when compared to a polar chest strap. Next is the battery charging, or lack of, as well as people generally satisfied with the product but not seeing it as value for money. I wasn't tallying up negative comments about the customer service because that is the company rather than the product, but if I was, it would have been easily over 100 negative reviews focused around that. The reason I put this section first is to make people aware of the reviewers who are calling out the free trial, which was anything but, with users essentially being duped into a non-refundable 12-month membership once their 30-day free trial had ended. Part of the issue was being unable to return their device due to slow customer service and therefore being liable for the full year membership. The free trial, rolling into membership, and the no refunds policy are both outlined in the latest terms of use, but this clearly wasn't communicated effectively for those in the trial process, and it's important that you are aware of this risk. So with all of that said, if you haven't been scared away by what sounds like some slightly shady practices, then we can go ahead to the actual review. Whoop is a wearable fitness tracker that is predominantly worn on the wrist, but can be placed elsewhere on the body, such as the bicep. They sell a range of Whoop sportswear that accommodates the sensor, including shirts, compression shorts, and underwear. Each one has been validated, so you shouldn't start seeing dramatically different numbers by changing the location of the sensor. The sensor has multiple colored LEDs tracking things like heart rate, skin temperature, and blood oxygen level. It is a reasonably snug fit, about a finger width from your wrist bone, and tight enough that you can't easily get a finger underneath. Charging for the wrist strap can be done without removing it, meaning uninterrupted 24/7 data collection if you so wish. It has a little battery pack, which itself is charged via USB-C and slips on and off when it needs topping up. It charges at roughly 1% a minute, so you'll be fully charged in under 2 hours. Once it hits 100%, I found that it took 4 full days to deplete it to around 25%, which is when a notification will pop up reminding you to charge it before your next sleep. The strap itself is fully waterproof, while the battery pack is water resistant for up to 2 hours at 1 meter depth. If you spend a lot of time in water, they do sell different bands, including a fast drying one for swimmers. If you want to take the strap off, it has a clasp, but as you can tell from the dent in my arm, it hasn't really left my wrist in the last 2 years except for airport security. The Whoop strap itself has no screen, so interaction is purely done through the mobile app, though you can access the data on the desktop via app.whoop.com. They're constantly refreshing the user interface and adding new features, so what I show you will soon be outdated, but in its current form there are 4 tabs on the homepage: Overview, Sleep, Recovery, and Strain. The section on planning has a weekly planner with templates you can choose for a given week, insights which appear based on the answers to your daily journal, and a planning overview with things like the sleep planner and your weekly and monthly performance assessments. There are then community stats with teams you can join based on your demographic, activity of choice, or just setting up a team with friends or co-workers. As you can see, there is a whole wealth of information, but it's worth understanding what data it is that they're measuring directly and what they are then deriving from that input. For all the different graphs and tabs on the app, it's only really measuring a handful of metrics. The main one of these is heart rate, and from that, something called heart rate variability, or HRV. HRV is the variation in timing between your heartbeats. Higher is generally better, and if you were improving your fitness, you would see this trend upwards over time. It also measures skin temperature and blood oxygen levels, which it does overnight. Since that's really it for the metrics, I'll quickly cover the trends feature and the various graphs you'll see on the app before moving on to the derived metrics. On the overview page is a customizable set of key statistics, and clicking HRV will bring up the trend view. So this is showing the last 30 days, with my average being 79 and typical range plus or minus 4 milliseconds. I can press the arrows to go back and see previous 30-day windows. I can select a weekly view, and if I've been wearing it long enough, I can see the data from the last 6 months. The 6-month view overlays the information from each 30-day period to help you get a feel for the trends. From there, you can use the top menu to select another metric, like resting heart rate. Another feature is the ability to touch a point on the graph and easily see what the exact value was on a given day. Certain graphs like sleep performance switch to a bar chart, and that's where there are categories with different threshold values for optimal, sufficient, and poor. An extra layer appears for recovery scores, where it applies the traffic light coloring system to the graph. So that's it for the raw metrics. Where Whoop tries to deliver value is to interpret things like heart rate and movement and deliver something more insightful. One of Whoop's own concepts is something called strain. It's a measure of cardiovascular and muscular load, and it's out of a hypothetical 21. I say hypothetical because I think you would need to be at near maximal heart rate for every waking minute of the day to actually hit 21. So in reality, high 20s is probably the limit, and on a given day, a few people in the community stats will hit 20.7. You have an overall day strain each day, as well as separate ones for every formally logged activity. A light day of activity is defined as a strain score of 10 or below. Up to 14 is moderate, 14 to 18 is strenuous, and 18 to 21 is all out. As you might have figured out by those labels, it isn't a linear scoring system. In fact, it's closer to logarithmic. That means if you do 2 workouts and each of them are 8 strain, you do not get 16 strain, you will get 9 or 10. It's not just workouts that contribute to your strain score. Any sort of activity that raises your heart rate will contribute to your day strain. The recovery score is another key metric for Whoop users, and probably the first thing they check each morning. It's a percentage based on a traffic light system, so 67 and above is green, 33 and below is red, and yellow in the middle. The inputs used to calculate your recovery score are HRV, resting heart rate, sleep performance, respiratory rate, so the number of breaths per minute as you sleep, blood oxygen levels, and skin temperature. Respiratory rate itself is a derived metric based on the fact that your heart rate speeds up very slightly when you inhale and slows down when you exhale. Those final 3 are only really useful to catch outliers. So you might have an infection that first presents itself as an increase in respiratory rate or skin temperature before your heart rate is affected. I mentioned sleep performance, and sleep itself is a derived metric which some people forget. Unlike the gold standard polysomnography, Whoop isn't measuring brain waves. Instead, it's taking information like movement and heart rate and using an algorithm to determine not only if someone is awake or asleep, but what stage of sleep they might be in. It can use movement to detect time in bed and combine that with sleep time to create second order metrics like sleep efficiency, which is the percentage of time in bed that you were asleep. It can also use the clock to define sleep consistency, which is whether you're going to bed and waking up at the same time throughout the week. Another feature is the stress monitor. This uses heart rate data to give you a continuous stress score out of 3. It then uses data from the motion sensor to try and differentiate between physical and mental stress. Whoop also reports a total calorie burn. This is first done by calculating your basal metabolic rate, your BMR, which is calories burned at rest. They do this by using the information in your profile, namely height, weight, and sex. On top of that, there's an amount of active calorie burn derived from heart rate. Comparing Whoop's estimated calorie burn during a period when my weight remained constant with my actual calorie intake, Whoop seemed to underreport by about 10%. Anecdotally, from 2 years of use, it does feel like its baseline calorie burn is too low for me. If I have quite an inactive day, it can register as little as 1,800 calories a day for me. Going back to the app, the daily overview reports your recovery and strain scores. Underneath that are my logged activities that day, as well as sleep duration. There are 4 ways to log an activity. You can click Start Activity when you're about to exercise. You can retrospectively add an activity that you completed earlier in the day. You can use the Strength Trainer, which I'll cover later. And if Whoop detects a period of activity, then it will make a suggestion which you can accept or edit. You can then choose key statistics that you'd like to see every morning, the stress monitor, which you've seen earlier, and finally strain and recovery in a 7-day chart. In the sleep tab is last night's sleep performance, again a percentage, as well as the hours of sleep you had versus the amount you needed. You can click on sleep need to see how it's calculated. So for me, it has a baseline, time added based on activity levels, and sleep debt, which carries over from previous nights. You then get 4 metrics displaying against their 30-day averages: time in bed, sleep consistency, restorative sleep, which is your time in deep sleep and REM sleep, and sleep debt, which does have a ceiling, so it doesn't go up indefinitely. There's sleep performance for the last week, the famous hours of sleep versus need graph, which for everyone I know with a Whoop has 2 lines that almost never touch. Then you have your sleep and wake times, a breakdown of your restorative sleep, and finally your sleep efficiency, which is sleep time divided by your time in bed. Recovery has a similar layout to the sleep tab with 4 of the key contributors to your recovery score. Some of those are then displayed again as 7-day graphs. So recovery score, HRV, resting heart rate, and respiratory rate. The strain tab is more of the same, a repeat of your daily activities, average daytime heart rate, calorie burn, then several 7-day charts. The last view for now is the health monitor, which is a summary of last night's readings, and underneath it's taking your own typical ranges to understand whether any numbers are out of the ordinary for you. Whoop have been busy building and releasing features since I became a member, with something new coming out at a regular frequency. On the main overview page is the Whoop Coach, released in September last year. This is an AI large language model based on ChatGPT-4 that has access to your data, allowing a more personalized response. You can ask questions relating to the product, how to interpret and optimize your scores, and more general questions about things like exercise. I mentioned the Strength Trainer earlier. This was released in April 2023 to appease those of us who do resistance training. Prior to that, it didn't feel like we were being adequately rewarded for our efforts in the gym based on strain scores. So you can choose between pre-made workouts, some from Whoop ambassadors like Rory McIlroy, or create your own. So here I am creating Friday's SPP workout, which is bench press, bent over rows, and pull-ups. I can then go straight into it and start warming up. And when I'm ready, I can start my first set. When I finish, I register an RPE out of 20 and save the session. Whoop will then decide how much of my workout was cardiovascular versus muscular strain. And if I want, I can tap into each set and see what my heart rate was doing in each one. I can also see an average heart rate for each working set. And in this case, it's giving me a strain score of 12.5. Whereas if I hadn't used the Strength Trainer, it might have been a 6 or a 7. The journal is found in the More tab, where you can customize from a huge list of what must be over 100 activities. The ones I tick are going to pop up each morning, and I answer them based on what I did or didn't do the previous day. Certain answers allow you to give additional information, but this isn't compulsory. What happens next is that Whoop tries to derive insights based on your answers. So when you've answered a question yes and no at least 5 times, you will then try to control for everything else. And within the planning section, you will see insights, which is the percentage increase or decrease in recovery score you see from logging that activity. So for me, it seems that eating meat is the best thing I can do for my recovery. And I can tap into that and see that I've eaten meat on 53 of the last 90 days. I've only recently gathered enough data for meditation, which is supposedly hindering my recovery, while stress and sickness are the worst too. Stress is one where I do fill in the additional information. Tapping into it, you can see it separates low from moderate to high stress, but both are quite negative. Within the planning section, I can access my sleep planner. Once you factor in sleep efficiency, it's recommended 10 hours 40 in bed to peak. I can change that to say that I only need to perform or get by. I can then set a haptic alarm, which is a vibrating alarm based on my metrics. You can then set a 1-hour window and the alarm will go off at some point in that time. Mine often goes off when I'm already up and eating breakfast, and you turn it off with a double tap, which even a 3-year-old can do. The final feature is technically just displaying data, but I think they do it so well that I would consider it a feature in itself, and that is the performance assessments. They come in two forms, the weekly and the monthly. I would say the monthly is more impressive, so I'm going to show you mine. I've also uploaded it to my website, and you can access that in the description below. This is my final assessment, April 2024. The first section shows the monthly averages for hours of sleep and sleep need, with a comparison to the previous month. Next to that is deep sleep in black and REM sleep in blue. That's followed by the hours of sleep versus need graph. You can see they do sometimes touch. Obviously, the goal is to close that gap. You can see restorative sleep stages every night because people can technically have 8 hours of poor quality sleep and not feel restored. The training breakdown color codes your most common activities. For me, I log both sprinting and tempo workouts as track and field, and then I lift weights on most days. Heart rate zones, personally, I don't pay that much attention, but I know a lot of endurance athletes will focus on being in a certain zone. You can see a lot of my walking is getting a strain of 6. That's typically my commute. And if I'm lifting weights, I accumulate strain faster than a track session, which is fair because at the track I might be doing 8 seconds of sprinting followed by 8 minutes of rest. I love the heat maps they include, so strain, where darker is higher. And you can see in winter I had a run of pretty beastly Saturday workouts, and my 4-week break over summer is picked up quite clearly. Recovery, only 5 red days in the last year, also picking up a stressful period at work where I found green days hard to come by. Sleep performance, reassuringly dark and very few nights where I'm getting insufficient sleep. Your recovery score is tied to an optimal strain for the day. If you fall below that, your day will be labelled restorative, while above that will be classified as overreaching. You can see on this graph that I spent a lot of time working harder than I supposedly should, and I'm almost never restorative, only just dipping into it at the end of my winter season. Finally, HRV and resting heart rate graphs on which they've superimposed a bar for each of the last 6 months so you can get a clearer sense of trends. My HRV plummets whenever I stop exercising, which I did for 2 weeks in March, and you can see an uptick in my resting heart rate too. Overall, as someone whose day job involves presenting data so that it's easily understood, digested, and most importantly, acted on, it feels like Whoop is at a really high level in the way that they present their data. One final note on features is that Whoop does provide pregnancy insights. I'm obviously not in a position to report on that firsthand, but as part of a study, they found that HRV trends downwards until an inflection point, which is 7 weeks before the baby arrives. This feature will show you the expected HRV across your pregnancy and maybe even alert you to a potential preterm birth. Everything up to this point has been objective. Hopefully you're now familiar with everything that Whoop has to offer. Next, I want to go through my own experience of wearing it pretty much non-stop for the last 2 years. The first few months of wearing it was a real eye-opener into where I was falling short in my recovery and exercise. If I show you my monthly assessment from the first 4.5 months with Whoop, I already had a dozen red recovery days and I was alternating between restorative and optimal strain, though to be fair, this was before the strength trainer. I can probably credit Whoop with my decision to take up sprinting again. Over the summer, I'd been doing calisthenics and not much else, and you can see what the first month of winter training did to my strain levels. It was April the following year that saw the release of the strength trainer. I was a little bit gutted at the timing because from September to January, I was living in the gym and I would have loved to see those numbers. If we skip forward to July 2023, I still have patchy red days. My training is much more balanced, including periods of overreaching, and my growing interest in improving HRV led me to find a few things that helped boost me from the 60s to the 70s. 2 years in, and I feel like I'm at a place of diminishing returns. I've learned so much from Whoop, both from the data itself and the Whoop podcast, if you haven't listened to that. And now the prospect of another 12 months on it doesn't seem as necessary anymore. What I consider to be the single most important metric that Whoop reports accurately enough to trust is heart rate variability. And once you know that, everything else kind of falls into place. I've done enough workouts to know what sort of strain they would achieve. And while I don't know the exact algorithm they use for the recovery score, it's clear that a very large part of it is based on HRV. When I sat down and listed out all the features, it seemed like Whoop was delivering so much. However, if you go through each one and you ask yourself, how much would I pay per month to know that? Its true value becomes a lot clearer. Beyond HRV, there is a little to be said for knowing your resting heart rate, though this is something you could measure yourself every morning. Skin temperature and respiratory rate are boring 95% of the time, though when it does spike, it is surprisingly good at giving you up to 48 hours notice of an incoming cold or flu. The only exception to that is when you accidentally sleep with your arm under the cover and you get a similar spike in skin temperature. I recently paired these data spikes with Vicks First Defense, a medication in the UK that helps stop colds before they progress. And with that combination, I can pretty much stay healthy all year round. Everything else to me is just 100 different ways to dress up HRV and movement, including things like sleep data. Right now, if you told me my HRV every morning, that's 90% of what I'm after. Aside from the value for money argument, I should also point out the negatives I've experienced since wearing the strap. I've had constant issues with sleep and wake, namely its inability to differentiate between the two. If I lie still enough between two periods of time when I am certain that I have been awake, I look back only to find that it is designated it as patchy light sleep. If you want a detailed breakdown of sleep accuracy, I'd recommend the Quantified Scientist on YouTube. Despite his conclusions that Whoop is one of the better sleep trackers, he does note that it is some way off of the gold standard. More recently, I've concluded that my long-term sleep problems have been made worse by wearing my Whoop. In a podcast with sleep scientist Matt Walker, he mentioned that there is such a thing as spending too much time in bed. Your brain then thinks, oh, if I've got 10 and a half hours in which to get 8 hours sleep, it doesn't matter if I have large wakeful spells within that time. What I've done since then is to deliberately reduce my time in bed. The knock-on effect is that Whoop no longer gets to wrongly assign some of my lengthy wakeful spells as patchy light sleep, so my sleep performance plummeted, while I was feeling equally, if not more well rested each morning. Finally, I've had lots of connection issues. It's likely that the vigorous movement of my arms during sprinting means that I lose live connection of my data, though I find that at the end of the session, it has uploaded everything correctly. The same is not true of the strength trainer. If I have connection issues, it will then assign everything to be 100% cardiovascular, much like it did for one of the highest volume workouts I did this year, which was a bit of a pain. I've had at least 2 instances where the strap has supposedly been too loose in the middle of the night and it stops recording and therefore only credits me with the first few hours of sleep of the night, which then throws off things like sleep debt and recovery scores for the following few days. The same happens if your Whoop has too low a battery, which is something I found out early on. You could go to bed with it at 20%, wake up with it at 10%, assume that everything is fine, only to find that it didn't record anything, which again has a knock-on effect across several days. In conclusion, I would say, like many products, the Whoop strap is something whose value declines over time, which isn't ideal because the membership fee does not decline over time. If you're an elite athlete, I can imagine the additional feedback provided by the Whoop can help you and your coach to optimize training and recovery, thereby improving performance. If you train recreationally, I also feel like the insights around HRV will spur you on to train harder and smarter in the first year or so of use. For sedentary individuals, I would hope that seeing just how much room there is to improve would be a motivation, even if it's just the positive effect on sleep that can be had from cutting out alcohol and late night snacking. Other than my concerns over the company's trickery regarding memberships and lack of refunds, I'd happily recommend the Whoop strap to anyone considering buying it. While it isn't the device out there with the highest level of accuracy, it feels like it makes up for that in its ability to drive people to healthier habits. What I can't tell you is if there's another product out there that is better value for money. I know a few people with a Garmin watch, something that is a single upfront payment and doesn't require charging every 4 days. There are also other wearables like the Oura Ring, which is a combination of upfront payment and a smaller monthly subscription fee. Personally, as someone who's now learning to rely solely on HRV, I'm happy to fall back on my Oura Ring, whose HRV measurements are very close to those of Whoop. I have no faith that any wearable in the market can accurately offer sleep staging or even sleep duration to a level that I would find beneficial, so I've learned to stop caring what it reports and just go off how I feel. Thanks for watching.